All right, we've got a 1996 Polaris Scrambler 400, and this is a four-wheel drive, but it doesn't really matter when we're dealing with the motor here. We're going to start by pulling off the cylinder head. Obviously, we've got this motor pulled. To do the top end work, you wouldn't have to pull this motor. These motors are notorious for breaking the crankcase, and I'll show you where to look for that when we get farther into it. But there's just such small tolerances on these that any amount of lack of oil or over rev or anything like that can cause that piston to break. Pieces go down into your bottom end, and there's just hardly any clearance between the crankcase and the crank, so it causes that case to break. It's just an aluminum case. So we'll pull this head off here. We pulled 6 12mm size nuts here to get this head off. You want to inspect it, make sure there's no damage up there from piston debris there. And then now we're going to go through and loosen up the 4 base nuts here. And these are sometimes a little bit of a challenge when you have the motor out, just because they can be a challenge to hold. These don't seem to be too terribly tight, but you want to make sure these are all torqued down going back together. And this motor did come out of the four-wheeler fairly easily. When the transmission is not attached, like Polaris does on these earlier models, it makes it a whole lot easier. We've got a coolant line here that's going to be in the way to get to that other nut, so we'll go ahead and remove that coolant line, and we're going to have to pull that line anyways to pull that cylinder off of that crankcase. These motors we can tear down awful quick because there's not a lot to them. And a Phillips screwdriver to remove these 2 clamps here. We've got the exhaust manifold here. There's a donut gasket that goes there, and those are pretty common that they go bad. Got a 13mm nut on here to take this manifold off. Wouldn't have to do this manifold now, but we'll finish pulling, well, maybe we'll finish pulling this cylinder and then worry about that manifold. All these parts we'll have listed online. Check out our store, deals 0040, and that would be, everything's done through eBay as of now. Got hundreds of Polaris parts, thousands of Polaris parts. A lot of this 94 to 98 range Polaris 2-stroke stuff. So check us out if you're needing parts for those. Can't get a socket on this one. Too close to that manifold, so we'll just spin it off there with a wrench. Oil pump sits in here, like I said. Oil line here. Control cable there. Alright, now that cylinder's ready to come off, you can use what I generally do, well, let's go ahead and, while we've got it set in here, so you can see a little bit better, we'll go ahead and pull the reed valve assembly. And that's an 8mm handful of bolts there. And then we've got a 10 millimeter for this line going into it. These boots, pretty common for them to get weathered really bad around there, and that will cause an air leak. You want to make sure you replace those. Here's your reed valve assembly. Here's your pedals here. Make sure that those aren't broken off. Make sure they shut tight. Make sure that those gaskets are good, going back together. Alright, well, I've got your motor tipped up here. I'll show you a pretty common spot, and then I'll show you another spot later on. But a pretty common spot for that cylinder or that crankcase to break is right in here. And the reason why is that cylinder comes down and will break. That piston will come down. If it comes down in pieces, break this case in this area, because there's just hardly any clearance, like I said earlier. And we'll pull this motor mount now. Now we'll finish this top end. That cylinder then will just kind of walk off of there. And if we're replacing piston and rings, this one's got a little bit of scoring there. Obviously replace, this is your base gasket, or this is your head gasket, replace that. Replace piston, rings. There is a piston pin and a roller bearing in there. So you want to make sure that when you're doing it, you replace all those things. If you just are leaking oil barely, you can just replace the rings, but I generally, you're in there, replace the piston, get the cylinder bored out, and just be done with it, so you're not doing it again in 6 months. So to pull the piston pin, take a small screwdriver or a pick and go in there. There's a groove, and I don't know if you can see it here from that angle, but there's a groove right there on your piston. Go in there with a, might have to be smaller than that. Get in behind that pin or that circlip, kind of pry it out of there. And these, if you've got a new piston coming, these circlips will come with it. So that'll just pop right out of there. And then you'll make sure, I try to keep my finger over so it doesn't pop out like it did and go flying. But that's it there. And just to put it in, do it the opposite way. Just put it in there as far as you can. Push down on the opposite side. I do my open end inside first. That way it can kind of come together like that. Now, on this, and take, sometimes you can get that piston pin to come out fairly easily. You just want to make sure you don't score up that piston, especially if you're reusing it. You want to make sure. And then also that bearing and certainly the crank, you don't want to damage that. So, just about out there. There we go. We've got your piston out now, and there's your piston pin. That'll slide all the way out, and there's your bearing there. So you inspect those, make sure they're good if you're putting them back together. Like I said, I just suggest replacing it. Here's your motor number here, right behind your cylinder there, and that'll tell you year, manufacturing, the motor number there. So we'll go ahead and flip this up now. We'll pull the recoil starter, and then we'll pull the stator and the flywheel. These bolts here are a 3/8, and why they switched to a metric is beyond me, but or a standard. Once we get those pulled out, this will come out. You can use a rubber mallet, makeshift handle they did there. Go ahead and tap on it. It'll break that seal, this seal here. And pull starter works good. The way this pull starter works, you pull this rope and this arm will pop out there, spring loaded, and it'll catch on your flywheel here on these grooves and turn your whole motor. And so that'll build up compression that way, and that's the way a pull starter works. This is your flywheel here, and we will go ahead and pull that flywheel. Got a 7/8 nut on here, regular threads. I go ahead and pull the washer too, and then what I do is put this nut back on there, and I'll show you why in a second. Just run it until it's flush with that. And then we've got our flywheel, our puller here. Looks like that. We've got 3 bolts here. Spin that on there. And the reason why we put that nut on there is because you've got a pin like there, a cap like this pushing against it. You never want that to damage that crank. So if you've got that nut on there, that'll kind of hold everything together. If this pin slides off to one side, you still get that nut on there kind of protecting that. So go ahead and put these in. You want to make sure these are threaded in most of the way. So you're talking 1/4 inch or maybe a little bit more in. I'd probably say closer to a 1/2 inch. You're not going to damage anything. And you want to make sure they're in there that 1/2 inch so that you don't pull these threads out, because you'll have quite a bit of force depending on if this has ever been apart before. You'll have quite a bit of pressure pulling those up. All right, and then you spin this down. Just remember you've got that nut on there, so it'll just pop off, and then you can, once it pops off, then it's free. And you can take everything apart and it'll just slide right off of there. It's a tapered crankshaft, and then that flywheel is tapered as well, and that's what keeps it on there. And then there's also a keeper. There we go. Flywheel is pulled. And it's magnetized, so keep that in mind. It'll be a little bit of a challenge to pull it off of there, but that's what your flywheel looks like. You've got your stator in behind there. And then we've got a keeper here. I like to take and, especially if you're splitting that crankshaft. Well, the only reason you do it is if you're splitting that crankcase. Pull this pin off of there. Sometimes that'll hold you up. A lot of times it won't. It's turned the right direction. But you never want this hitting against those bearings. So go ahead and pull that. I put that with the flywheel. Then we've got Phillips screws. 3 Phillips screws holding this plate on. And then the wire's running out here. So these look like they've been done before. Don't look like they're in very good shape, so we're going to use this impact driver. Oh, actually, they weren't even that tight. One hit with an impact driver, and a lot of times that will take care of it. All right, your stator plate is off. You can replace just the coils there if you want to. Most people, if you're getting an aftermarket, which I'd suggest somebody like Rick's, You want to pick a name brand manufacturer if you're getting them aftermarket. You don't want knockoff Chinese junk. Knockoff anything, doesn't have to be Chinese in general, but there's your stator there. And then this is your starter drive, so when your starter engages, what it does is turns this and it'll spin this fast enough to slide this out. It grabs the flywheel and turns that motor over. So that gear there, sometimes these won't slide back in. So if it sounds like your starter is always engaged, what happens is it starts your four-wheeler and then it stays stuck out and it continues to keep your starter engaged. So you want to be careful. That spring in there goes bad. Sometimes it gets water in there, debris, and it'll hold that open and end up ruining your starter that way. So we'll go ahead and finish pulling the bolts on this side. These are for your crankcase here, so we've got a handful of 10 millimeters. Let's see, 5 12 millimeters. Then I'm going to pull this back motor mount here. Alright, now we've got a spanner nut here that you'll be able to see. And it's a bit of a challenge when that cylinder is off. Not a lot to hold that. So what I do is I grab if you do it this way, there's tools that they make to pull those off. Now I don't even have the tool, and I've done hundreds of these motors. But since I'm pulling the crankcase apart, you can just replace this spanner nut when you order parts for everything else. So I grab a chisel and I loosen them that way. Got one more bolt down here holding this starter on. And your starter's out. These starters, Polaris, they've got a bad idea here. These starters sit on the bottom of the motor, and the starter is the very lowest place for water to go. So if you get water in here, if say your engine's leaking, some coolant goes in there to seal, or your recoil here doesn't have its cap on there, water gets down there, then it'll go and sit in that carburetor, or excuse me, that starter, and it'll destroy that starter pretty quick. So this is a plate here that comes off. This isn't even your crankcase. So we'll grab a chisel then. And loosen this up. And make sure that when you're doing it, the crank's gonna turn. A lot of times what I'll do is grab a Sharpie marker and mark the crankshaft and that nut to make sure I'm turning. If we're having problems with it turning, we've got to stick something in that crank so that it keeps from spinning, but it's loosening now. If we had something holding that crank, then we would have been loose by now. If you do it this way, you want to make sure you don't get into that case when you're hitting this. We might end up sticking something in that crank just to speed this up. Alright, we'll go ahead and stick a... I like to use something plastic so we're not damaging. Well, that crank doesn't feel very good anyways, maybe. I guess it doesn't matter, that crank isn't going to be good. Obviously don't want to damage that case because that case is good. I'm not going to be able to hold it there with that. Let's see how well this works. Kind of a makeshift deal there. Alright, we were able to get it off of there. This nut is a right hand turn nut, so you turn it clockwise to loosen it. Keep that in mind because you'll be hitting for a long time going the other way. You'll just be tightening it up. So you want to make sure that you're turning it clockwise to loosen it. So now this cover, I believe, is ready to come off of here. You can tap on it. I wouldn't tap on a port very hard. But once you get that nut off of there, this cover will come off fairly easily. And we've got your oil pump behind there. And then this gear, we may need to pull. Sometimes they come off fairly easily. We'll see how easy this one comes apart. Got a 10mm nut holding that impeller on. This impeller will just slide off of there, but it's sealed up pretty good, so you want to be careful you don't damage it pulling it off. Just you want to pry on a little bit from either side, and then obviously replace that seal. Alright, impeller's off there, so you can see it. Now that we have the impeller off, we can get this water pump inner cover off. And same seal is kind of holding this up. Again, you don't want to get too hard on it. And you, again, certainly don't want to damage that crankcase. this shaft that it's sitting on here, pretty common for these to get grooved, and then you've got to replace that shaft. Now this shaft here, it's got